Deep inside the remote Escambray Mountains of Cuba lies a cave shrouded in mystery. The cave, which has never been filmed before, contains some of the greatest geological marvels in the world. Once the stuff of blood-soaked legend, the secrets of Martin's Inferno are only now being revealed. This is the story of the dangerous and risk-paved road we took to get there. It is also a record of the wonders within the cave and of a personal journey that may have set one man's soul to rest. The Earth's mountains have been climbed, its seas and rivers sailed, its continents explored, and the space above it observed. The only part of our planet left largely uninvestigated is the world underground. Less than 2% of the world's caves have been visited by human beings. A group of Cuban speleologists, or cavers, formed an expedition to explore a very special cave. They were led by Alejandro Emperador, Vice President of the Cuban Speleological Society, and accompanied by Canadian geologist and speleologist Charles Young. We were there to film them. Our journey began in the peaceful, picturesque town of Trinidad on Cuba's south-central coast. The calm pace and bucolic ease of this charming Caribbean hamlet provided us the last truly peaceful moments we would know for some time. My name is Germán Gutierrez. I'm a documentary filmmaker from Montreal. I'm no speleologist. In fact, I had never been caving before making this film. But as a documentary filmmaker with a love of science, people, and exotic places, I was happy to join the expedition, and so was the small filmmaking crew from Montreal that accompanied me. To be the first people ever to film Martin's Inferno, a group of strangers would have to learn to work together, to bring several tons of equipment over very rough terrain. We risked failure every step of the way. The stuff of haunting local legend, Martin's Inferno would not reveal its secrets easily.
Mi padre, en el año 60, en la década del 60.
In the 1960s, my father had heard of a cave in the mountains called Martin. Local legend had it that he was an escaped slave who chose to die there rather than be captured. The existence of the cave had never been proven, and I was lucky enough to be the first person who discovered it in 1967. At Caleta Munoz, the members of the Canadian film crew met the Cuban caving team for the first time. The caving team included a doctor, mountaineers, a systems analyst, electricians, civil engineers, machinists, biologists, topographers, expert climbers, and speleologists. We couldn't have asked for a more highly trained and professional team. The success of our expedition, however, rested on a major challenge. As the director, I had to make sure a multidisciplinary and multinational group of people speaking 3 different languages, got along under tough working conditions. This was no walk in the park. After all, 2 previous attempts to film Martin's Inferno had failed. There was no guarantee we wouldn't be the third. From Caleta Munoz, we drove into the mountains as far as our trucks would take us. It was a bumpy, tricky ride. At El Colorado, the trucks could go no further. From here, all our supplies had to be transferred. There was food for 700 meals over 8 days, clothing and camping gear for 30 people, mountaineering and geological testing equipment, and of course, our filmmaking equipment. And all of it had to be offloaded in the humid 35-degree heat. Still, working in the hot sun was better than the alternative. The previous attempt to film the cave in 1998 had been scuttled by equipment failure and torrential rain. For the remainder of the trip through the mountain jungle, we loaded everything onto mules supplied by amused locals. Many of them seemed to think we were on a fool's errand. Did they know something we didn't? Our biggest challenge was going to be lighting the cave. The giant stalagmite inside Martin's Inferno is 67 meters tall, the height of a 22-story building. It towers over a pitch-black gallery the length of 2 football fields. Getting enough light into the cave to film the stalagmite without harming the cave's fragile ecology would strain a Hollywood budget. To accomplish it with our modest documentary means would take a lot of ingenuity and luck. It was a long, hard, humid hike. Frequent rests were necessary. After a good day's climb, we arrived at the main entrance to the cave. Walking through the spectacular curved opening, we were tired but exhilarated. Tomorrow, the difficult work of bringing equipment into the cave would begin, but for now, it was time to rest and relax. Despite our differences, we were getting along. Canadian, Cuban, scientist, filmmaker, and yet, as night fell over Martin's Inferno, we could almost feel the presence of the slave who gave the cave its name. In 1791, a slave revolution ripped through Haiti. The bloody revolt cost a Frenchman named Marcel Lafitte his coffee plantation and the life of his beloved wife. A year later, Lafitte and his son Camille sailed to Cuba to establish a new plantation. Among the Cuban slaves was a man called Martin. Martin had a beautiful young daughter called Maria. Her charm and warmth overcame the cruel Camille, but Maria preferred another. In a jealous rage, Camille murdered his rival and took Maria by force. Another slave ran to tell Martin, but by the time he arrived, Maria's virginity had become a stain of shame on the unforgiving ground. Machetes were drawn. After a brutal battle, Camille lay dead at Martin's feet. Martin became a cimarron, a runaway slave. Marcel Lafitte, inconsolable, offered a great reward for Martin's capture. A group of local farmers headed off to find him. The hunt lasted for days. Finally, weakness and injury overcame him. Bloodied and limping, he arrived at Martin's Inferno. He groped through darkness to escape the farmers. Suddenly, Martin found himself at the edge of an enormous dark abyss. To hesitate meant sure capture. His only other choice, to leap into the darkness and into the arms of certain death. He leapt.
Bueno, al fin logramos llegar a la cueva.
The second morning of our expedition began with Alejandro detailing what the day had in store. To begin with, we would have to transport our gear into the main chamber. This meant moving 4 tons of equipment down a 45-meter sheer drop into pitch darkness, and then down several hundred more feet at an 80-degree incline. The Cuban scientific team was eager to begin carrying out a biological and geological survey of the cave. I was particularly anxious to hear what Walter Klimke, the film's lighting director, had to say. The crew would be stringing over 2 kilometers of heavy electrical cable down into the cave and moving the lights and 6 generators into the main chamber. If the equipment broke or failed to work, we wouldn't have enough light to make our film. To make matters even more tense, the equipment had not yet arrived. It had been too heavy to carry by donkey, and we were waiting for it by helicopter. At that point, the helicopter's arrival was still unconfirmed. Javier Mujica, the Cuban chief mountaineer, emphasized the danger of descending down a sheer wall into pitch darkness. Because one mistake could result in death, he said it was necessary that the Canadian film crew undergo extra training. Concerned about the exertion that would be required, Marlene Diaz, the team doctor, insisted on taking everyone's blood pressure. Despite the danger, our Cuban friends reassured me. They were professional and experienced.
Suéltate la mano. Con esta mano, aguanta aquí y con esta ponme. Ahí. Ya.
Mira, Javi, pero no tiene un mayorcito.
Vete al lado de él que está bajando y le comentas y le hablas ahí cualquier cosa y
Yo comencé en la espeleología desde muy pequeño.
I've been interested in speleology since I was a child, thanks to my father. He brought us with him to visit caves all over the western provinces of the island. He encouraged me to follow in his footsteps. Later on, Antonio Núñez Jiménez, the founder of the Cuban Speleological Society, taught me the scientific secrets of these subterranean landscapes, these worlds without sunshine. Here you could find all kinds of underground marvels. I've been grateful to him my whole life. To be a speleologist, you have to know about meteorology, topography, and geology. You also have to have mountaineering skills to ensure everyone's safety.
Las cuevas, su origen, su formación, su clasificación.
I needn't have worried about the helicopter. As we were planning, it was being loaded with heavy equipment back in Trinidad de Cuba. Most of the equipment had been shipped from Montreal. Getting the gear from there to our cave required the cooperation of 2 governments, ground crews, and bureaucratic personnel. It also required piloting skill and the cooperation of the weather. Yet, somehow, It all went off without a hitch. Perhaps, after all, our determination would be rewarded. By now, the mysterious cave has already begun to give up some of its long-held secrets.
Material eléctrico. Cuídenme bien, mi abuelita.
El origen de esta cueva, según estudios realizados por nosotros, es de origen fluvial.
Our research tells us that this cave is fluvial in origin. Millions of years ago, the mountains in this region contained large valleys, through which rivers flowed. These rivers penetrated the rock and formed Martin's Inferno. The Escambray Mountains and the fluvial caves within reveal the importance that water can play in geological formation. This is one of the rainiest places in Cuba, with an annual rainfall of 2,000 millimeters. This vast amount of water has been falling on land formed primarily of limestone, with spectacular result. The constant heavy rainfall and violent, prolonged post-glacial flooding have played a major role in forming caves like Martin's Inferno. Essentially, the cave was carved out of the mountain by the constant flow of water. Our initial exploration of Martin's Inferno told us much about its geology. Over millions of years, the constant flow of water created a hole where the main entrance now stands and carved out the large main chamber. Then, the flow of water formed a second chamber where we set up our camp. Over many more thousands of years, the water continued downhill and formed the huge chamber we now call Martin's Inferno. In it stands the world's largest stalagmite, a marvel shaped by nature over millions of years. When the helicopter arrived, it couldn't land near the cave mouths. Updrafts made it too risky. Instead, it had to settle on a mountaintop 200 feet from the cave. That meant that the heavy equipment, including 6 generators, had to be brought down by hand. Once again, our team had to undertake risky, grueling work. One mistake could have meant damaged equipment or personal injury and a sudden end to our project. And once again, this team of strangers speaking different languages had to work together as friends. In the end, we succeeded. Walter had his generators. The show could go on. First, a way had to be cleared to the small opening by the main chamber, some distance through the dense jungle from our camp. Then, a complicated rappelling system had to be installed to move the equipment. The experience and ingenuity of our Cuban friends made it possible. The spectacular openings of the caves, we learned, were caused by the frequent earthquakes engendered by the shifting tectonic plates beneath Cuba. The island of Cuba itself is slowly moving eastward at a rate of 3 centimeters a year. Geologically speaking, the land beneath us was a world in motion.
Okay, Walter, this is the full map of the cave.
Yeah.
As you see, the cave goes from north to south. This is the north arrow. This is the main entrance. The camp area, it's around here.
Finally, everything was ready to start moving the equipment down to the main gallery. Mojica went over the map with everyone to make sure the film crew understood the layout of the cave. Walter figured it would take most of the day to get all the lighting equipment down and into place.
Gerardo, vamos a tensar la cuerda por la cual va allá a tirolínea, cuando la vamos a guiar.
4 cables were installed to ensure the safety of the crew and equipment. Last, the difficult and dangerous work of moving an inexperienced Canadian film crew into the darkness began. The descent started with a sheer 45-meter drop. For the experienced Cuban cavers, it appeared easy, but they insisted on installing thin ladders for the Canadians and on taking every safety precaution. Walter, as lighting director, was first to go. While he joked about it, it was clear that he, like us, was nervous.
We're on our way.
Recoge la cuerda, Henry.
All right.
Bye.
Bye. See you guys later.
See you later. Alligator.
In a while, crocodile. See you soon, Ragu.
Bloqueen allá.
¿Sí? ¿Tú?
There we go. Okay.
Slowly and carefully, the crew descended, and after them, the equipment. For the experienced speleologists, the descent took only 20 minutes. For the civilians, who were doing it for the very first time, it took a strenuous and nerve-wracking hour and a half. Lights and cables were lowered into the shadows. Then, for the first time in more than 1,000,000 years, where there had been darkness, there was light.
Listo, listo. Frijolitos, sí. Listo, gracias. Listo.
In all, it took 2 days to complete the difficult job of lighting the cave. Strangers were becoming friends and spirits were high. The work had gone well. But no one had worked as hard as our cook, Victor Fernandez, whose day started at 4 in the morning and ended 19 hours later at 1 a.m.
Vamos a dar un aplauso al nene por la comida, pues.
Night fell outside the cave. With it came visitors. Bats filled the cave. We were surprised to find them in such huge numbers in the mountains. The bats roosted in holes in the ceiling of the cave called bell holes. Normally, the bats roost along the edges of the bell holes. In some way still not yet fully understood by science, this roosting along the edges helps in the actual formation of the bell holes.
También se halla en otras islas de la Antilla también.
One of the purposes of our expedition was for Jose Ramos, the team biologist, to catalog details about the 3 different bat colonies who called the cave home. Jose determined that thanks to an abundant food supply, the colonies were doing well. Everything was proceeding to plan, and yet my mind was still not at ease. Tomorrow, the expedition would descend into the main chamber. There was more danger ahead. Dawn brought another day, full of promise. This was the big day. We were descending into the cave to film its contents and gather essential scientific information. And we would leave with the first filmed images of one of the greatest wonders of the subterranean world. Charles, our Canadian geologist, began his survey early on.
We're in the twilight zone of the cave here, and if you look outside, you can see
large trees there in the tropical rainforest. But as we come inside and as the plants are more deprived of sunlight, they get smaller and smaller. Now down here we get also different kinds of plants like ferns and so on. If we continue on into the cave, the final green thing we see are blue-green algae or filamentous algae.
As we left the world of vegetation, we entered another realm, the living kingdom of minerals.
We're inside one of the very large entrances of Martin's Inferno, and I'm surrounded here by a lot of stalactites and stalagmites. What's really interesting here is that we have these very strange-looking stalagmites. They're wandering off in all directions. Usually stalactites come straight down, stalagmites go straight up, but here the stalactites seem to be bending around in different directions. If you look at these things, you'll see that in general they point out towards the entrance. Well, what could be causing this? Well, it's probably due to evaporation. The evaporation, which is causing this precipitation, is highest at the entrance. So these things will tend to grow towards the entrance as we get the most precipitation on the side where there's the most evaporation. Now, if we look around, these things twist and turn in all directions. And this is probably because there are complex winds that move around in the chamber here. And so these things will probably tend to head into the wind. Another interesting feature of these formations, which actually we call anemolites because they're formed by wind, is that we have stalagmites growing on top of them, going straight up, and stalactites going straight down underneath them. And this is probably a matter of competition. Now, these stalagmites and stalactites probably grow quite quickly, and so they go straight up and down, whereas the strange-shaped deposits tend to grow rather slowly.
En el caso de estas plantas que llegan aquí mediante las semillitas que las transportan.
To my surprise, we found vegetable matter stubbornly fighting for life, even in a world without light. Jose told us that the soil of the cave was extremely fertile, thanks to the rich sediments brought in by the flow of water and by the many fruit grains carried in by the bats flying through the caves. The soil is so fertile, in fact, that the small plants we found grow as tall as they can in their search for light. But they remain white in color because they're deprived of sunlight and therefore photosynthesis, which would create the chlorophyll that turned them green. As a result, the plants have a very short lifespan.
You'll see the bedrock here. So some of the stalactite deposits have disappeared. We're walking through the main chamber of Martin's Inferno, and we're surrounded here by many very interesting mineral deposits. It really is a fantastic area. But over to my right, there's a really fantastic example, a very beautiful example of a stalactite that's growing down and a stalagmite growing up. Eventually these two will meet and we'll get a column, and we see many of those throughout the cave. But how does this process take place? The story starts, I guess, at the surface, and on the surface, hundreds of meters above us, I'm not quite sure how far, in the soil we have organisms that are living there, and they're part of this story. When we get rainfall, the water goes into the soil, and the organisms in the soil generate carbon dioxide. This carbonic acid goes down into fissures and dissolves away this carbonate schist. Now, the carbonate schist has the right ingredients for making these calcite formations. What we need is calcium, carbon, and oxygen, and all those exist in the bedrock. Well, as the water goes down, it's picking up this calcium carbonate and going through fissures. It's pretty contained there. But once it reaches the cave and the water drips out into the cave, then we see the carbon dioxide start to come off. It starts to get emitted. And once it does that, it can't hold that dissolved load anymore. So we get precipitation. And so we see precipitation at the ceiling in the form of a stalactite, and we see precipitation at the floor in the form of stalagmites. This is a huge stalagmite deposit. It's composed of calcite, which has come out of the bedrock from the ceiling above. And you can see that the stalagmite is still forming. You can see water coming down. It's coming right by me here. And it might be interesting to see how much calcite is being deposited, being precipitated by this water. And if we did that, then maybe we could get some idea of the age of this deposit. What I find really fascinating about this cave is that we'd see these very large accumulations of calcite. And I'm going to continue around the cave and see what else I can find.
Some of our team took time to sample the abundant water. It was deliciously pure. After all, it had been filtered over and over again as it traveled through miles of rock into the cave.
Esta especie de cangrejo es fluvial.
We also found a river-dwelling crab within the cave. The crab was a female, and probably the only one of its kind in its new home. It had been washed into the cave environment and had adapted very well to its new environment. It too had found abundant food sources and apparently lived undisturbed by the total lack of light.
Las larvas vienen arrastradas por el agua hasta acá, vive aquí, ve, pertenece más a la familia de los pseudotelfúcidos. Coge ese color rojizo. Se ven estas listitas que están activas, no ves el agua.
En esta parte de la cueva encontramos varias formaciones secundarias. Aquí se encuentra, estas formaciones se encuentran en el techo y las paredes de la cueva.
Javier showed us some secondary formations, moon milk and some helictites. A distinguishing feature of the cave was its many very large stalagmites, some only relatively smaller than the behemoth we were heading to. To our amusement, the calcite walls of the cave had unique sound properties. You could almost say they were singing. Scientific information to follow.
Ah, mira, esta especie de cucaracha.
In addition to biology and geology, we were adding to our zoological knowledge. Jose told us that this type of cockroach is very well adapted to the cave environment. Though it can see very well, it has grown large antennae, sensitive to the slightest vibrations in the air, for hunting and protection.
Rara en cuevas.
We're here in the final chamber of Martin's Inferno. What's interesting here is that out in front of me is a mud flat. This is the final part of the cave. These mud flats are filling the cave further on. So what this represents is that sediments got washed into the cave and blocked the way on, blocked the river passage. We can also see that the cave flooded at this time too. If we look behind me, you can see some stalactites that have these coral-like formations over them. And these coral-like formations only grow underwater. In fact, we can follow these up on the roof for about 10 meters. So it looks as if some time ago we had a big lake in here that was 10 meters deep. At any rate, that lake is now drained away, and we're left with the mud flats. And when Alejandro Emperador rediscovered the cave some 35 years ago, all that was here was the mud flats. Now, since that time, a small hole has appeared over in one corner, and it looks as though those sediments are now being washed away again. Maybe in a few years, we'll be able to follow the cave further. And I'm going to go and check this hole out and see where it goes.
After our difficult work and the host of challenges it entailed, we were ready to light the world's largest stalagmite. It measures 67 meters in height, as tall as a 22-story building. Until 1967, the stalagmite thought to be the world's largest was in Hungary, and it is less than half this one's size, at around 25 meters.
Hace 35 años llegamos a esta cueva.
35 years ago, we discovered Martin's Inferno. The local person who showed it to us thought that there were two caves. He said you could throw a stone in from the main gallery and not hear it drop. He insisted that we see it, and we were tired and a little resistant. Then we saw that this was really a monumental cave. A few months later, we organized an exhibition with ladders and ropes. You have to understand that speleology was very rudimentary in Cuba back then. We had very primitive ropes, and we built 3 ladders out of planks that we attached close to here before lowering them into the cave. When we started to go down, we couldn't see the bottom or the sides of the cave because our lights weren't strong enough. I had the honor of going first. Luckily, we found a shelf at about 15 meters, and from there we could see a continuing incline of about 80 degrees. We finally reached bottom, and that's when we first saw the impressive stalagmite you see behind me. Some stalagmites are 20 or 30 meters high. We prepared our first report to the Cuban Speleological Society in 1970. We were talking about the biggest stalagmites in all of Cuba. Captain Antonio Núñez Jiménez, the Society's president, asked us to confirm our measurements, because he thought we might have found the largest stalagmite in the world. Representatives from Hungary who were here for a conference had actually worked on a 25-meter-high stalagmite called the Telescope in Agtelek. We invited them to see the cave, and later we went to Hungary. When they got here, they were stunned to see these calcite deposits formed over millions of years. The first time I came down here, I told my companions that I felt like I was going into hell, and that's where the name Martin's Inferno came from.
Que yo creía que estaba bajando al infierno. Y de ahí surge el nombre de Martín Infierno.
I'm standing beneath this monolith, towering 67 meters over my head. This is actually the largest stalagmite in the world, and I'm having a lot of trouble getting to grips with it. I've never seen anything like this. I've been to caves around the world, and especially in the tropics where you find large formations, and nothing approaches the size of this. We can see that it's been forming for a long time, and it's grown right up to the roof. We've been trying to get some idea of how old it is by making some measurements. Well, we know it's 67 meters high, and recently our Cuban party did a survey around the base of it. And we don't have the figures yet, but somewhere around 80 meters was traveled, and we were able then to calculate the volume of this thing. And from the volume, we came up with a figure for its mass, which is something like 15,000 tons. So one might wonder how long it takes to accumulate 15,000 tons of calcite, because that's what this deposit is. If you look at the literature and you look at how fast these things grow, the fastest that grow and the slowest that grow, when we look at this, we come up with figures that anywhere between 25,000 years and 1,000,000 years. I think it's probably toward the 1,000,000-year end, but I'm only guessing. We can see also that it's very red in color. It's got a lot of oxidized iron minerals. And actually, it's a very complex deposit because we can see cracks and fractures and places where parts of the layering have come off. So it's actually decaying away, this deposit. But on the front end here, we can see that it's currently growing. I think it's a bit of a competition between what's growing now and what's decaying. I think the decaying is actually winning.
We had done it. A team of people from different backgrounds, strangers to one another, had overcome obstacles and bonded together to unlock the secrets of Martin's Inferno. How different from the tragic tale that gave it its name. As I looked around at this natural wonder, I thought to myself, perhaps by working together, we had laid the spirit of poor Martin to rest, and perhaps this cave could know an even better future.
What's the future for this particular stalagmite? Well, I don't know, but when we look around this cave, we see that this fluvial cave has collapsed in places and is collapsing. It's in a very mature state. And I would like to think that the roof will collapse back and this stalagmite will sort of support the roof and will become, as it were, a doorway into the cave in the future. But this could be hundreds of thousands of years into the future. But anyway, I'm very impressed with what I see here. I've seen nothing like this before.
El futuro de esta cueva es un futuro muy
I
extraordinario.
predict an extraordinary future for this cave. I think it's one of the great wonders of the world, and that it should be considered a precious part of our global heritage. To protect it, the Cuban government already declared it a national monument. Now we have to convince institutions like UNESCO to declare a World Heritage Site.
Las Naciones Unidas, la UNESCO, para declarar esta maravilla del Carso mundial, patrimonio de la humanidad.
When it came time to leave, we dismantled our equipment. A cave which had not known light for 1,000,000 years was once again plunged into darkness. Who knows when and if it would ever see light again? For now, it was time to celebrate, and to let my team know just how grateful I was to share this wonderful experience with them.